Our Disagreements by Joseph Stalin, first published the 19th of January 1921 in Pravda, number 12. Our disagreements on the trade union question are not disagreements in principle about appraisal of the trade unions. The well-known points of our programme on the role of trade unions, and the resolution of the Ninth Party Congress on the trade unions, which Trotsky often quotes, remain and will remain in force. Nobody disputes that the trade unions and the economic organisations ought to and will permeate each other. Nobody disputes that the present period of the country's economic revival dictates the necessity of gradually transforming the as-yet nominal industrial unions into real industrial unions capable of putting our basic industries on their feet. In short, our disagreements are not disagreements about matters of principle. Nor do we disagree about the necessity of labour discipline in the trade unions and in the working class generally. To talk about a section of a party, begin quote, letting the reins slip out of its hands, end quote, and leaving the masses to play of elemental forces, is foolish. The fact that party elements play the leading role in trade unions and that the trade unions play the leading role in the working class remains indisputable. Still less do we agree on the question of the quality of the membership of the central committees of the trade unions and of the All-Russian Central Council of Trade Unions. All agree that the membership of these institutions is far from ideal, that the rank of the trade unions have been depleted by a number of military and other mobilisations, that the trade unions must get back their old officials and also get new ones, that they must be provided with technical resources, and so forth. No, our disagreements are not in this sphere. Part 1. Two methods of approach to the mass of the workers. Our disagreements are about questions of the means by which to strengthen labour discipline in the working class, the methods of approach to the masses of workers who are being drawn into the work of reviving industry, the ways of transforming the present weak trade unions into powerful general industrial unions capable of reviving our industry. There are two methods, the method of coercion, the military method, and the method of persuasion, the trade union method. The first method by no means precludes elements of persuasion, but these are subordinate to the requirements of the coercion method and are auxiliary to the latter. The second method in turn does not preclude elements of coercion, but these are subordinate to the requirements of the persuasion method and are auxiliary to the latter. It is just as impermissible to confuse these two methods as it is to confuse the army with the working class. A group of party workers, headed by Trotsky, intoxicated by the successes achieved by military methods in the army, supposes that those methods can and must be adopted among the workers and the trade unions in order to achieve similar successes in strengthening the unions and in reviving industry. But this group forgets that the army and the working class are two different spheres, that a method that is suitable for the army may prove to be unsuitable, harmful, for the working class and its trade unions. The army is not a homogeneous mass. It consists of two main social groups, peasants and workers, the former being several times more numerous than the latter. In urging the necessity of employing chiefly methods of coercion in the army, the Eighth Party Congress based itself on the fact that our army consists mainly of peasants, that the peasants will not go to fight for socialism, that they can, and must, be compelled to fight for socialism by employing methods of coercion. This explains the rise of purely military methods as a system of commissars and political departments, revolutionary tribunals, disciplinary measures, appointment, and not election to all posts, and so forth. The mistake that Trotsky makes is that he underrates the difference between the army and the working class. He puts the trade unions on a par with the military organisations and tries, evidently by inertia, to transfer military methods from the army into the trade unions, into the working class. Trotsky writes in one of his documents, begin quote, "The bare contrasting of military methods, orders, punishment, with trade union methods, explanation, propaganda, independent activity, is a manifestation of Kautskian, Menshevik, socialist revolution prejudices. The very contrasting of labour organisations with military organisation in a workers' state is shameful surrender to Kautskyism." End quote. This is what Trotsky says. Disregarding the irrelevant talk about Kautskyism, Menshevism and so forth, it is evident that Trotsky fails to understand the difference between labour organisations and military organisations, that he fails to understand that in the period of the termination of the war and the revival of industry it becomes necessary, inevitable, to contrast military with democratic, trade union, methods, and that therefore to transfer military methods into the trade unions is a mistake, is harmful. Failure to understand that lies at the bottom of the recently published polemical pamphlets of Trotsky and the trade unions. Failure to understand that is the source of Trotsky's mistakes. Part 2. Conscious democracy and forced democracy. Some think that talk about democracy in trade unions is mere declamation, a fashion, called forth by certain phenomena in internal party life that, in time, people will get tired of chatter about democracy and everything will go on in the old way. Others believe that democracy in the trade unions is, essentially, a concession, a forced concession to the workers' demands that is diplomacy rather than real serious business. Needless to say, both groups of comrades are profoundly mistaken. Democracy in the trade unions, i.e. what are usually called normal methods of proletarian democracy in the unions, is conscious democracy, characteristic of mass working class organisations, which presupposes consciousness of the necessity and utility of systematically employing methods of persuasion among the millions of workers organised in the trade unions. If that consciousness is absent, democracy becomes an empty sound. While war was raging and danger stood at the gates, the appeals to aid the front that were issued by our organisations met with a ready response from the workers, for the mortal danger we were in was only too palpable, for that danger had assumed a very concrete form, evident to everyone in the shape of the armies of Kolchak, Yudenich, Denikin, Pilsudski, and Wrangel, which were advancing and restoring the power of the landlords and capitalists. It was not difficult to rouse the masses at that time, but today, when the war danger has been overcome and the new economic danger, economic ruin, is far from being so palpable to the masses, the broad masses cannot be roused merely by appeals. Of course, everybody feels a shortage of bread and textiles, but, firstly, people do contrive to attain both bread and textiles, in one way or another, and, consequently, the danger of a food and goods famine doesn't spur the masses to the same extent as the war danger did. Secondly, nobody will assert that the masses are as conscious of the reality of the economic danger, shortage of locomotives and of machines for agriculture, for textile mills and iron and steel plants, shortage of equipment for electric power stations, and so forth, as they were of the war danger in the recent past. To rouse the millions of the working class for the struggle against economic ruin, it is necessary to heighten their initiative, consciousness, and independent activity. It is necessary by means of concrete facts convincing that economic ruin is just as real and mortal a danger as the war danger was yesterday. It is necessary to draw millions of workers into the work of reviving industry through the medium of trade unions built on democratic lines. Only in this way is it possible to make the entire working class vital interest in the struggle which the economic organisations are waging against economic ruin. If this is not done, victory on the economic front cannot be achieved. In short, conscious democracy, that method of proletarian democracy in the unions, is the only correct method for the industrial unions. Forced democracy has nothing in common with this democracy. Reading Trotsky's pamphlet, The Role and Tasks of the Trade Unions, one might think that he, in essence, is also in favour of the democratic method. This has caused some comrades to think that we do not disagree about the methods of working trade unions, but that is absolutely wrong, for Trotsky's democracy is forced, half-hearted, and unprincipled, and as such merely supplements the military bureaucratic method, which is unsuitable for the trade unions. Judge for yourselves. At the beginning of November 1920, the Central Committee adopted, and the Communist Group at the Fifth All-Russian Conference of Trade Unions carried through, a resolution stating that, begin quote, most vigorous and systematic struggle must be waged against the degeneration of centralism and militarised forms of work in a bureaucracy, tyranny, officialdom, and petty tutelage over the trade unions. That also of the Sectran, the Central Committee of the Transport Workers' Union, led by Trotsky, the time for the specific methods of administration for which the central political administration of the railways was set up, owing to special circumstances, is beginning to pass away, end quote. That, in view of this, the Communist Group at the conference, begin quote, advises Sectran to strengthen and develop normal methods of proletarian democracy in the Union, end quote, and instructs the Sectran, begin quote, to take an active part in the general work of the All-Russian Central Council of Trade Unions and to be represented in it on an equal footing with other trade union associations, end quote. See Pravda, number 255. In spite of that decision, however, during the whole of November, Trotsky and Sectran continued to pursue the old semi-bureaucratic and semi-military line, continued to rely on the central political administration of the railways and the central political administration of water transport, strove to shake up, to blow up the ARCCTU, and upheld the privileged position of the Sectran compared with other trade union associations. More than that, in a letter, begin quote, to the members of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee, end quote, dated November 30, Trotsky, just as unexpectedly stated that, begin quote, the central political administration of water transport cannot possibly be dissolved in the next 2 or 3 months, end quote. But what happened? 6 days after that letter was written, on December 7th, the same Trotsky, just as unexpectedly, voted in the Central Committee for, begin quote, the immediate abolition of the central political administration of railways and the central political administration of water transport, and the transfer of all their staffs and funds to the trade union organisation on the basis of normal democracy, end quote. And he was one of the 8 members of the Central Committee who voted for this against the 7 who considered that the abolition of these institutions was no longer enough, and who demanded, in addition, that the existing composition of the Sectran be changed. To save the existing composition of the Sectran, Trotsky voted for the abolition of the central political administration in the Sectran. What had changed during the 6 days? Perhaps the railway and water transport workers had matured so much during the 6 days that they no longer needed the central political administration of the railways and the central political administration of water transport. Or perhaps an important change in the internal external political situation had taken place in that short period. Oh, of course not. The fact that the water transport workers were vigorously demanding that the Sectran should dissolve the central political administrations and that the composition of the Sectran itself should be changed, and Trotsky's group, fearing defeat and wishing at least to retain the existing composition of the Sectran, was compelled to retreat, to make partial concessions, which, however, satisfied nobody. Such are the facts. Escaping these prove that this forced, half-hearted, unprincipled democracy has nothing in common with the normal methods of proletarian democracy in the unions, which the Central Committee of the party had recommended already at the beginning of November, and which is so essential for the revival of our industrial trade unions. In his reply to the discussion at the meeting of the Communist Group at the Congress of Soviets, Trotsky protested against the introduction of a political element into the controversy about the trade unions, on the ground that politics had nothing to do with the matter. It must be said that in this Trotsky is quite wrong. It scarcely needs proof that in a workers' and peasant state, not a single important decision affecting the whole country, and especially if it directly concerns the working class, can be carried through without one way or another affecting the political condition of the country. And, in general, it is ridiculous and shallow to separate politics from economics. For that very reason, every such decision must be weighted up in advance, also from a political point of view. Judge for yourselves. It can now be taken as proved that the methods of Sectran, which is led by Trotsky, have been condemned by the practical experience of the Sectran itself. Trotsky's aim in directing the Sectran and influencing other unions through it was to reanimate and revive unions, to draw the workers into the task of reviving industry. But what has he actually achieved? A conflict with the majority of the communists and the trade unions, a conflict between the majority of the trade unions and the Sectran, a virtual split in the Sectran, the resentment of the rank-and-file workers organising trade unions against the commissars. In other words, far from a revival of the unions taking place, the Sectran itself is disintegrating. There can be no doubt that if the methods of the Sectran were introduced in other unions, we would get the same picture of conflict, splits, and disintegration. And the result would be that we would have dissension and a split in the working class. Can the political party of the working class ignore these facts? Can it be asserted that it makes no difference to the political condition of the country whether we have a working class solely united in integral trade unions or whether it is split up into different, mutually hostile groups? Can it be said that the political factor ought not to play any role in appraising the methods of approach to the masses, that politics have nothing to do with the matter? Obviously not. The RSFSR and its associated republics now have a population of about 140 million. Of this population, 80% are peasants. To be able to govern such a country, the Soviet power must enjoy the firm confidence of the working class, for such a country can be directed only through the medium of the working class and with the force of the working class. But, in order to retain and strengthen the confidence of the majority of workers, it is necessary systematically to develop the consciousness, independent activity, and initiative of the working class, systematically to educate it in the spirit of communism by organising it in trade unions and drawing it into the work of building a communist economy. Obviously, it is impossible to do this by coercive methods and by shaking up the unions from above, for such methods split the working class, the Sectran, and engender distrust of the Soviet power. Moreover, it is not difficult to understand that, speaking generally, it is inconceivable that either the consciousness of the masses or their confidence in Soviet power can be developed by coercive methods. Obviously, only normal methods of proletarian democracy in the unions, only methods of persuasion, can make it possible to unite the working class, to stimulate its independent activity, and strengthen its confidence in the Soviet power, the confidence that is needed, so much now, in order to rouse the country for the struggle against economic ruin. As you see, politics also speak in favour of the methods of persuasion. January 5th, 1921, Joseph Stalin.